Do you believe skin bleaching is a form of self-hate or just a style? Please explain the reason for your answer.
It's self-hate for me because if it is that you understood the damage and the implications, you would be aware that you're damaging your skin. And I don't think anybody would consciously want to damage their skin if they like their skin. So if you look at your skin and you see something that you don't like, you're going to try and change it. So once you want to change what is there because you don't like it, it's self-hate. And it is because you were not taught that this skin is a badge of honor. It is not a badge of shame. But because socialization again and society has been so big on the Browning syndrome, and it's a fact, around you see that. If you walk into a store, when we were studying as students in Barbados, the dark-skinned ones among the dark-skinned among us, when we go to Cave Shepherd, we'll be followed, and we'll be going with other students who have lighter skin. And when you look across, you're the only one who they're following, and the brown-skinned one is being treated as a regular tourist. You know? So the attention and the focus is negative towards you. And so it makes some people who are not firm in who they are want to say, if life don't have to be so hard, me not want the black skin here, me I go change it because this black skin is the reason for my problems and I don't like it. So self-hate. Not enough people appreciate that and believe it, that nothing is wrong with your skin being black. Some people will say it, but they don't believe it. I remember I had a lady before me a time in court, and she was in her 50s, and she told me that over the last 2 years was the first time in her life that she was looking at herself in the mirror and appreciating her reflection. She said she never used to look in the mirror because she grew up hearing that she's black and ugly. And she believed it. She said she didn't like to look in the mirror because she didn't like what she was seeing. And she said it was at a church service she was, and the pastor was preaching about bleaching and people and black skin and brown skin. And she said when the pastor preached, and she said this is somebody who would go to church regularly. But this one sermon made a difference for her because it touched on an issue that she herself was grappling with from childhood. And for the first time, she was confronted to think about it now in the context of how the pastor was presenting it. And she said when she went home, she cried, and she said to herself, she have to look at herself in the mirror today. And she said to do that, what she had to do to get to that, to just stand up and look in the mirror, she said it felt like somebody was lifting a heavy weight off her shoulder. And she said since that moment, she has not looked back. She said she didn't realize what she was missing out on her self or for herself all of this time, because now she said you can't take her out the mirror. She look in the mirror for everything. She look in the mirror, even when she don't need to look in the mirror, she look in the mirror like she's making up for all the last years of not looking in the mirror. But it is self-hate, and it is because we were taught to hate ourselves. We were taught that yes, it's a white Jesus go and save you, because we grew up seeing the white Jesus on the almanac in our houses. So you were always taught that always look up to the person who is brown or white, because see, then bring Jesus to you as a white man. Only when you get older you unlearn these things. The same thing, certain jobs, that is brown people or the white people going to get it. So you are made to feel that you're less than. So you're going to hate your skin because it's your skin is the reason that you're not going to get this job that this white person or this brown person is going to get. So self-hate, it was made a live thing. We were taught to hate ourselves. So yeah, that it goes back right to skin bleaching. There is still that thing about it that, yeah, it's not relevant anymore, but it still is because people still think that we are not being people. That's why I say education don't do anything for people, you know. Education really don't do nothing for people because I hear it a lot from educated people. I had a young man before me recently, and when I look at him, he come before me for child maintenance, you know, child support. So when I look at him face white. So I say, where you find money for buy bleaching cream, but you can't find money for maintain a child? So boy, Judge, you want to know, you know, me have to bleach because brown people are get you into the world, and the black nothing not go on for you when you're brown. So me have to get brown for things can go on for me so I can make more money. And I said to myself, boy, I'm going to take a lot of work. We need more than one session with him. And I just had to look at him and I said to him, you know, I pity you because you're a father. And when you do what you're doing, you're telling your child who might be your complexion, natural complexion or darker, that his skin is not good enough. Because his teacher teaching your child something. And every time I drive on the road and I see it and I see women who look like mothers and I see men who look like fathers, I said to myself, what is happening to the generation that you're raising? Because you teach them to hate them skin. When them see mommy turn brown and them know them born come see a black mother, you tell them, say, yeah, the black way comes in a good transition. So you're creating the monster of self-hate more by just teaching them by your actions to do that. But and some of them know the dangers, but they are willing to take the risk. Yeah. So you know the self-hate is that deep.
Eric Alona, the victim's family believes the young boy was targeted for a number of reasons. Now, this is the very intersection where Xavion Parker gets off of the school bus and heads home each and every day. He says he first saw a red truck with flames on the side on Friday. Yesterday, he was approached by the same vehicle, and things went downhill from there. It's a scary ordeal that sounds straight out of the movies. Houston Police Department responded to reports of a missing child Monday after Xavion Parker never showed up after school. He was found safe a couple of hours later, but what he says happened to him has his family shaken. Parker says as he was walking home from the bus stop, a red truck pulled up and several young men grabbed him and pulled him inside, all while the adult driver cheered them on. From there, he says he was taken to an abandoned property full of guns and torture items. He was assaulted and punched, and his phone, shoes, and jacket were stolen. When the group was in the other room, he managed to make it out and take off as fast as he could. That's when driver Carmesia Carmouche saw him running down Loxley near Wayside and stopped to ask if he was okay. She called police and eventually got him home safe, but Michelle Lee says she won't feel peace until the suspects are caught. HPD says the driving suspect is described as a white man with a heavy build, straight orange hair, and tattoos on his arm, one of which is a racial slur.
The reason why they got him because they said he was black. You deserve to die. Exactly his words. And he said the dad had like a white muscle shirt on, and you could see, he said it was right here, big as day. I hate black people.
Who can imagine what could be the feelings of a father and mother when looking upon their infant child whipped and tortured with impunity and placed in a situation where they could afford it no protection? But we are all claimed and held as property. The father and the mother were slaves. I was compelled to stand and see my wife shamefully scourged and abused by her master. And the manner in which this was done was so violently and inhumanely committed upon the person of a female that I despair in finding decent language to describe the bloody acts of cruelty. My happiness or pleasure was then all blasted, for it was sometimes a pleasure to be with my family, even in slavery. I loved them as my wife and child. Little Frances was a pretty child. She was quiet, playfully bright, and interesting. But I could never look upon the dear child without being filled with sorrow and fearful apprehensions of being separated by slaveholders because she was a slave, regarded as property. And unfortunately for me, I am the father of a slave. It calls fresh to my mind the separation of husband and wife, stripping, tying up, and flogging, and tearing children from their parents and selling them on the auction block. It calls to mind female virtue, virtue trampled underfoot. But oh, when I remember that my daughter, my only child, is still there, destined to share the fate of all these calamities, it is too much to bear. If ever there was any act of my life while a slave that I have to lament over, it is that of being a father and a husband of slaves. Happy Monday, happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, and I am continuing my reading of Dr. Joy DeGroove's great book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing. And I started my reading at the very beginning of chapter 4, which is post-traumatic slave syndrome. So today we are going to learn exactly what post-traumatic slave syndrome is and how it manifests. But before I get to that, I want to do two things real quick. I want to give a shout out to my new patron on Patreon, Stephen L. Steed. Thank you, Stephen L. Steed, for becoming a new patron. Welcome to the family. Welcome to the family. And I also want to give a big thank you to Nair for this book. Nair mailed me the book about Marcus Garvey, and I am very appreciative. I'm thankful. Thank you for the book. I love it when I get books. I really, really do love books. I love reading. I love learning. And this is something I'm definitely adding to my collection. I'm going to read it. I'm going to enjoy it. And, you know, it's all love. And I appreciate Nair. And thank you. So I want to make sure I do that. So to show the people, you know, the love that's out here. So thank you. So as you can see from the first clip and the second clip, we're talking about the trauma. We're talking about the effects of post-traumatic slave syndrome. We're talking about what post-traumatic slave syndrome exactly is, how it came about, why it came about, who it came from, who was it inflicted upon, how long it was inflicted upon, what type of acts were inflicted upon specifically African people, because we're talking about post-traumatic slave syndrome and people of the African diaspora, but specifically Black people in America, right? How does this post-traumatic slave syndrome manifest itself in Black people in America today, right? How does trauma affect people today? So the trauma that we experienced that started in the 1400s, but specifically in America in the 1600s. So the trauma that started then, it lasted for 400 years, and all of the trauma after that leading up to today. How did it affect us? How does slavery affect Black Americans today? And why should slavery affect Black Americans today? These are things that we're getting into. So jumping back into page 113, trauma's effects. All right. What are the impacts of generations of slavery and oppression on the people? In order to begin to understand the magnitude of this legacy on contemporary African Americans, it is important to examine the diagnostic characteristics of trauma. What are the effects of trauma on human beings? What does trauma look like? How does the trauma manifest itself, right? If I someone, say an attendee at one of my lectures, most would agree that the victim of the shooting would be severely traumatized. A gentleman seated a few rows away from the victim might be somewhat less traumatized. Someone walking in the hall that heard the could possibly be traumatized. Some family members of the victim informed about the may be intensely traumatized, while others very little. There might even be a woman seated next to the victim who may not experience any symptoms of trauma whatsoever. This is because human beings react to events differently, right? So we know that. Laying the groundwork, right? With the destruction of the World Trade Center in New York on September 11, 2001, and I talked about this before, right? Many Americans once again became familiar with the term post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, right? Lots of citizens were reported to be suffering from the disorder as a result of witnessing the destruction of those buildings and the deaths of those trapped inside. At the same time, while most individuals who repeatedly witnessed the news coverage of the towers toppling did not seem to suffer any enduring mental or emotional damage, some did, right? People do indeed respond to traumas differently. With what is known about trauma, it is probable that significant numbers of African slaves experienced a significant amount of trauma to warrant a diagnosis of PTSD, right? Since there are no living African American slaves today, I would have to hypothesize using current diagnostic criteria. The Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders Revised describes features of disorders, reports the conditions which may give rise to them, and lists each disorder's symptoms. These all help clinicians with making accurate diagnoses, right? However, it is not necessary for an individual to show evidence of all of the listed symptoms. So you don't have to show evidence of everything to warrant being diagnosed with a specific illness. The following are a list of some of the conditions which give rise to mental and or emotional traumas that justify the diagnosis of PTSD. So we're laying this groundwork now. We're laying this groundwork. So here are some of the conditions, right? A serious threat or harm to one's life or physical integrity. A threat or harm to one's children, spouse, or close relative. Sudden destruction of one's home or community. Seeing another person injured or killed as a result of accident or physical violence. Learning about a serious threat to a relative or a close friend being kidnapped. Stressor is experienced with intense fear, terror, and helplessness. Stressor and disorder is considered to be more serious and will last longer when the stressor is of human design. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All 7 of them are examples of conditions which give rise to mental and or emotional traumas that justify the diagnoses of PTSD, right? So it is important to note that the manual states that any one of these above stressors is enough to cause PTSD. So once again, you don't have to have all of the conditions, all of the symptoms. You can display one or more. So what about African slaves? Many slaves did not experience just one of the above stressors. Rather, many experienced all of them. And the great preponderance of slaves were subjected to these traumatic experiences over and over again, right? Taking into consideration the fact that slaves brought to the Americas from Africa were exposed to a lifetime of traumas, even with the fact that not everyone is traumatized by traumatic events, anyone with limited astuteness could surmise that a considerable number of African slaves are likely to have suffered from PTSD. If you got any type of reasoning in your mind, in your brain, somewhere in there, you already know that African slaves suffered PTSD. Look at the conditions that they lived in, and we're going to go into more detail, right? Today, those who are diagnosed with PTSD exhibit symptoms that may require clinical treatment, inclusive of drug therapy, right? Some of the symptoms of PTSD include, PTSD symptoms: intense psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of an traumatic event. Physiological reactivity on exposure to internal or external cues. Marked diminished interest or participation in significant activities. Feeling of detachment or estrangement from others. Restricted range of effect. Sense of foresight in future. In other words, does not expect to have a career, marriage, or children, or normal lifespan. Difficulty falling or staying asleep. Irritability or outburst of anger, and difficulty concentrating. And what's interesting is these symptoms. So I work in HIV/AIDS prevention. So when in my city, when somebody is diagnosed with HIV/AIDS, my organization is one of the organizations where they can receive HIV care. So when we are enrolling a patient into our care system, one of the evaluations that we give them is called a PHQ-9. I don't remember exactly what the PHQ-9 stands for, but it's a mental health evaluation, basically. It's a mental health evaluation. And I bring up the PHQ-9 because the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, the 9 symptoms, the 9 exhibited symptoms of PTSD that I just described are in our PHQ-9. Those are exact things that we ask in our PHQ-9 because we are assessing we're assessing the mental state of the patient. How healthy mentally is this patient that we're bringing into our care system? And if the patient does exhibit symptoms of depression or PTSD, then we can make sure that we refer that patient to the proper mental health professional to help them be able to manage the PTSD, right? So it is familiar with me because it is something that I myself have questions I've asked patients myself. So the maintenance of healthy and secure relationships. Now, this is important. That's why I highlighted this to read. The maintenance of healthy and secure relationships is among the most important values within African culture. And if Europeans have studied us, like I know they've studied us, they understand the nature of our relationships. And that is one of the reasons why our relationships are falling apart now, because white supremacy white supremacy, making sure that they attack the Black family unit or attack Black relationships, period. We have to have declining relationships within our communities, within our societies, within our families, so that we cannot build strong families, strong communities, or strong societies. So what do you think would happen if these relationships were destroyed and never allowed to fully take root again, right? If you were going to devise a uniquely cruel system of punishment, you could never have devised something more devastating and insidious than American chattel slavery, because it absolutely categorically destroyed existing relationships and undermined people's ability to form healthy new ones. So going back to what Neely Fuller said, we are insane. So our ability to form healthy relationships has been greatly damaged by white supremacy. But once again, it is up to us to understand what happened so we can fix what happened to us, because they will not fix what happened to us, because if they were, they would have done it by now. So it is important that we read these books. It is important that we consume this information. This is why I believe my channel is a very important channel here on YouTube, especially for Black people, for all Black people. If you want to get the information that we need to help ourselves, I'm doing my best to make sure we get the information, right? So perhaps one of the greatest impacts, though, were the daily efforts of the slave owners and others in authority to break the will of the slaves. Free will is at the core of being human. Free will is. Can you imagine what it must be like to have your will assaulted on a daily basis? You live in a society that constantly reminds you that you are no different from livestock, and in some cases, you are less valuable than livestock. When you attempt to express yourself, you are beaten down. When you attempt to protect your loved ones, you are beaten down. You are beaten down until you call the cruelest and most vile man you know master. And God forbid you attempt to be educated or think for yourself. As a result of centuries of slavery and oppression, most white Americans in their thoughts as well as actions believe themselves superior to Blacks or greater import. Too many African Americans unconsciously share this belief, going back to the first clip of skin bleaching, right? It is not surprising, for as I have outlined in chapter 2, centuries of repetition and justification have gone into establishing such understanding, right? It is from the impacts of past assaults that we must heal, and it is from the threats of continuing assaults that we must learn to defend ourselves, our families, and our communities. If you build it, you must protect it. History have shown us that over and over and over. It's not just a white supremacy thing. It's a human thing. It's in the nature of human beings to conquer. So, passing down the effects of trauma. So this is page 116, bottom paragraph, passing down the effects of trauma, right? Upon hearing the term post-traumatic slave syndrome, some of my readers might think to themselves, how could African Americans today possibly be affected by events that occurred so long ago? After all, African Americans are free now. In fact, they have been free for a long time. I've often heard European Americans irately say, you know what? I didn't own slaves, okay? And I'm tired of feeling guilty about what happened over 100 years ago. So get over it. My response to them is that I am not a slave now, nor have I ever been a slave. And as far as I know, nobody I've known personally was a slave. The fact is, I don't have any experience of being a slave. However, 246 years of protracted slavery guaranteed the prosperity and privilege of the South's white progeny, while correspondingly relegating its black progeny to a legacy of debt and suffering. It doesn't really matter today if either of us, black or white, directly experienced or participated in slavery. What does matter is that African Americans have experienced a legacy of trauma. And so what is a legacy? Because, oh shoot, that word is often used, legacy. What is a legacy? How is it transmitted? So the legacy of trauma is reflected in many of our behaviors and our beliefs. Behaviors and beliefs that are at one time were necessary to adopt in order to survive, yet today serve to undermine our ability to be successful. I mean, I got to mark that because I got to read that again. So the legacy of trauma is reflected in many of our behaviors and our beliefs. Behaviors and beliefs that at one time were necessary to adopt in order to survive, yet today serve to undermine our ability to be successful because we have yet to really, truly replace the programming. We didn't replace the programming that we received. And so we're still running off a slave-minded program. We have to free our minds in order to understand that we're no longer in survival mode. We can thrive now. We can thrive. She's getting, and this, what we're getting here, we're getting to beliefs. So we're starting to talk about beliefs and behaviors, because our beliefs affect our behaviors. What we believe in, our mantras, our sayings, the things that drive us. What we believe in affects our behavior. It can dictate morals, values, ideas, the way we communicate with each other, the way we treat each other. If I believe you are less than me, or better yet, if I believe that I am less than human, then my behavior will be the behavior of somebody who believes that they are less than human. The question remains, how are such acts of trauma transmitted through generations? The answer is quite straightforward. How do we learn to raise our children? Almost entirely through our own experience of being raised. Most of us raise our children based upon how we ourselves were raised. Of course, there are things our parents did that we decided we'll do differently, but for the most part, parenting is one of a myriad of skills that is passed down generation to generation. What do you think gets passed down through generations if what was experienced were lifetimes of abuse at the hands of slave masters and or other authorities? What do you think the result would be if generation after generation of young men were not allowed the power and authority to parent their own children? What do you think the result would be if education was prohibited for generations? What do you think would be the result if the primary skills that mothers teach their children are those associated with adopting a lifetime of torture? Today, we know that if a child has an abusive parent, the likelihood that he or she will grow to be abusive is greater than if a child comes from a safe and supportive home. We know that if a child comes from a violent home, there's a greater likelihood that the child will grow to be violent. We know that if a child comes from a home in which one or both parents went to college, there's a greater likelihood that the child will go to college. We know that our children receive most of their attitudes, life skills, and approaches to life from their parents and beliefs. We also know that most of these are learned by the time they are 5 or 6 years old. And remember, She's not saying that it's absolute that if a child comes from a violent home that the child will be violent, but she's talking about the likelihood is increased. Let's remember, and I want to make this point. The likelihood, if both my parents were gangsters, the likelihood of me being a gangster is higher than the likelihood of a child who comes from a home in the suburbs where gang life is not even something relative to their existence or just their life, right? Likelihood. She's not talking absolute. She's talking likelihood. We have to decrease the likelihood of our children remaining, keeping the slave or the victim mindset. We have to reduce the likelihood of our children not being successful. We have to reduce the likelihood of our children dying early. We have to reduce the likelihood of us not loving ourselves by learning the information and applying the information. So getting more and talking about the training that the children receive, right? So James P. Conner, this is an excerpt from James P. Conner. The slave family existed only to serve the master, and in order to serve physically, psychologically, and socially, the slave family had to develop a system which made survival possible under degrading conditions, right? The slave society prepared the young to accept exploitation and abuse, to ignore the absence of dignity and respect for themselves as blacks. The social, emotional, and psychological price of this adjustment is well known. All right, so that is from James P. Conner talking about the conditions that the black slave family had to live under. Constant stress, constant torture, constant trauma, constant terror, constant, right? While some of what we learn through direct instruction, the bulk of our learning takes place vicariously through watching others. The individuals and families that survived the slave experience reared their children while simultaneously struggling with their own psychological injuries. They often exhibited the typical symptoms associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. The children lived and learned the behaviors and attitudes of the often injured and struggling parents. Today, we are those children, right? In addition to the family, the legacy of trauma is also passed down through the community. During slavery, the Black community was a suppressed and marginalized group. Today, the African American community is made up of individuals and families who collectively share differential anxiety and adaptive survival behaviors passed down from prior generations of African Americans, many of whom likely suffered from PTSD. The community serves to reinforce both the positive and negative behaviors through the socialization process. For example, in the 1940s, families frequently suppressed any sign of aggression in their childs, particularly their male children. It was an acceptable and expected practice of African American communities to severely beat unruly boys who they would never make the mistake of standing their ground with a white person in authority. So that reminds me of a story I've told before, but I'll tell it again. My mother told me several times. My grandmother, her name was Sadie, and let's say an insurance collector. I don't remember the exact position of the white person, but the insurance collector, I would say, was a white boy who was younger than my grandmother, who would come around and would address my grandmother as if they were equals. My mother didn't like it. So one day, the young white boy addressed my mother as they were equal, addressed my grandmother as if they were equals. My mother, being a young child, stepped to the man and tried to check him. My grandmother punished my mother for doing that because the idea was this white man, no matter his age, this white man has authority over us, and you should never challenge the authority. That mindset would keep you enslaved forever. Just know we broke that. Just know that. Shout out to grandma, but we broke that. While the direct relationship between the slave experience of African Americans and the current major social problems facing them is difficult and empirically substantiated. We know from research conducted on other groups who experience oppression and trauma that survivor syndrome is pervasive in the development of the second and third generations. The characteristics of survivor syndrome include stress, self-doubt, problems with aggression, and a number of psychological and interpersonal relationship problems with family members and others. And so this is an excerpt from Yael Dayanli in the International Handbook of Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma. So the intergenerational perspective reveals the impact of trauma, its contagion, and repeated patterns within the family, right? It may help explain certain behavior patterns, symptoms, roles, and values adopted by family members, family sources of vulnerability, as well as resilience and strength, and job choices, following in the footsteps of a relative, a namesake through the generations. Viewed from a family symptoms perspective, what happened in one generation will affect what happens in the older and younger generations. Though the actual behavior may take a variety of forms, within an intergenerational context, the trauma and its impact may be passed down as the family legacy, even to children born after the trauma. If the trauma isn't addressed, if the trauma isn't fixed, it's going to be continued to pass down because this is how we behave now. We talk about epigenetics. It is epigenetically embedded in us, if I could say it like that, but the trauma is embedded within us. This is how we think, behave, walk, talk, all of that. So this is the definition of post-traumatic slave syndrome. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is a condition that exists when a population has experienced multi-generational trauma resulting from centuries of slavery and continues to experience oppression and institutionalized racism today. Added to this condition is a belief, real or imagined, that the benefits of the society in which they live are not accessible to them. This then is post-traumatic slave syndrome. And let me read it again. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is a condition that exists when a population has experienced multi-generational trauma resulting from centuries of slavery and continues to experience oppression and institutionalized racism today. Added to this condition is a belief, real or imagined, that the beliefs of the society in which they live are not accessible to them. Thus, then is post-traumatic slave syndrome. So multi-generational trauma together with continued oppression and absence of opportunity to assess the benefits available in the society leads to post-traumatic slave syndrome. Multi-generational trauma together with continued oppression and absence of opportunity to assess the benefits available in the society leads to post-traumatic slave syndrome. Post-traumatic slave syndrome, right? So what is a syndrome? Make sure we understand what a syndrome is. A syndrome is a pattern of behaviors that is brought about by specific circumstances. A pattern of behaviors that is brought about by specific circumstances. The circumstances that produce PTSD, multi-generational trauma, and continued oppression, plus a real or imagined lack of access to outlined above, what is the resulting pattern of behavior? Well, there is no single pattern of behavior. There are many. I've identified three categories, and that is vacant esteem, ever-present anger, and racist socialization. So these are three things, three patterns of behavior, three categories that we can look at and identify that Black people have these things, and these things are associated with post-traumatic slave syndrome, right? Vacant esteem, ever-present anger, and racist socialization. So belief. Let's get into the crux of belief, right? The power of belief and how belief can help or harm a group of people. Before we examine the patterns of behavior associated with PTSD, we briefly need to discuss belief because belief is intricately woven into the syndrome's fabric. Belief is a truly powerful thing, much more powerful than most people suspect. Our beliefs color everything which we come in contact. They determine what we perceive and how we evaluate. They determine what we consider unlikely and what we consider possible. They shape our memories as well as our expectations. They strongly influence how we think and feel. Belief is powerful. Belief is very powerful. What you believe in can determine the quality of your life. What you believe in will help lead to the decisions that you make. What you believe in is very important. What we believe about ourselves is even more important. What we've been trained to believe is important as well. That's why I'm always talking about us making sure we have a paradigm shift, inserting a new program into our psyche so that we can have a different outlook on life, a different belief about ourselves, to stop believing all of the negativity that we've been taught over the centuries, to stop believing all of the negativity that is continuing to be drilled into our minds, the messaging that we get, the propaganda over the years. Belief is powerful, man. When the young begin believing that their future is bleak, they sometimes respond in ways that boggle the imagination. In the early 90s, the Washington Post reported that children who were living in some poor Washington, D.C. neighborhoods were engaging in fatalistic behaviors. Children as young as 10 years old started to plan their own funerals, identifying the clothes that they wished to be buried in, along with the accompanying music to be played. According to some psychologists, these children felt such hopelessness that it appeared they were no longer trying to triumph over death. They were instead reconciling themselves to it. So that leads to vacant esteem. When you are a teenager who's accepting death, and I was close to it because we had been told so much for so long that young Black boys die at 21. We started to believe that we would die at 21. So after the age of 21, we had to learn how to live. We had to learn how to thrive. We had to learn how to be different after the age of 21. It was a difficult transition, but it was one that was much needed. After being told for so long that young Black men die at the age of 21. Even though violence was not in my immediate environment, violence surrounded me. Violence was not in my immediate environment. I knew how susceptible I was to their violence around me, but it's just what we believed. And then we heard so many stories, seen so many stories about Black men, young Black men dying, young Black boys dying. So why would we believe we would live past 21? But I'm glad I did. So now we can move past the vacant esteem, but we have to address the vacant esteem. What is vacant esteem? Esteem has to do with worth and value. Self-esteem is the judgment we make concerning our own worth. Through the years, there have been many ways people have tried to define and measure self-esteem. Often these definitions confuse self-esteem with self-confidence or self-efficacy. While self-confidence and self-efficacy have to do with our beliefs about how effective and competent we consider ourselves to be, self-esteem, though related, refers to our beliefs about our value to our families, our friends, our community, and the world at large. How do I see myself? How do I see my value? How do I value myself? And how do I see my value to the world around me? Am I valuable? Am I worthy? Do I have a purpose? Why am I here? Do I matter? Do I matter to myself? Do I matter to others? Am I worth anything? These are questions we've all had to deal with we've all had to work through and grow through. Let's continue to grow. The healing has not stopped. The healing is continuous. Remember how long we were in this. The healing is continuous. You won't cure over 400 years of oppression in one lifetime. So how do we develop healthy esteem? There is a direct relationship between the degree to which we as human beings participate in productive services to ourselves and others, and the overall development of esteem. The groundwork of the development of esteem begins at birth. I asked my husband to define what our newborn grandson worth was. He paused momentarily to consider the question and asked me to explain what I meant by worth. I asked him, what is Nasir's value? He responded by saying, he represents the potential and hope of the family. He represents the continuation of our family lineage and legacy. He represents the future generations. What is clear is that my grandson has value to us despite the fact that he has not yet contributed in any noticeable way. It is our belief in his value that the foundation for his esteem begins to be laid. In the first few months, that foundation is built upon by simple smiles, hugs, and kisses, later through words and praises and encouragement. By the time he is walking, he will be given opportunities to serve, and he will be shown appreciation for his service. It may start out with asking him to pick up toys and put it away. Then as he grows older, he will come to know his value both by his helpful acts and our family's expression of appreciation. As an adult, we expect him to do work as a purposeful and meaningful work that contributes to our society. So in this way, individuals arrive at their self-esteem first as a result of the appraisals of the significant others in their lives, later as a result of having their contributions appropriately recognized, right? And family as the result of the meaningfulness of their own lives. Children and adolescents who are given little responsibility and or great praise for meaningless actions can easily grow up to be narcissistic, having too great an assessment of their worth. They think too highly of themselves and haven't done anything. We have too many children out there like that today, right? Conversely, children and adolescents who receive little appreciation for the actual value of their contributions can easily grow up with an undervalued assessment of their worth, ultimately believing themselves to be of little or no value. In the best of worlds, children are given greater and greater opportunities to do meaningful work, along with being given the appropriate level of appreciation for their contribution. In this way, healthy self-esteem is developed. Got to start raising these kids different and got to start raising these children better. You got to work for it. You got to earn it. You can build your child up, but build them up in the right way. Don't just give them things just because. We're not helping their esteem. They're not helping their worth. So vacant esteem is the state of believing oneself to have little or no worth, exacerbated by the group and social and societal pronouncement of inferiority. Vacant esteem is the result of three spheres of influence: society, our community, and our family. Society influences us through its institutions, laws, policies, and media. The communities in which we live influence us through establishing norms and encouraging conformity to a society at large. Our families influence us through the ways in which we are raised and groomed to take our place as our parents see it in our community and society. When these influences all promote a disparaging and limited identity to which we believe we are confined, vacant esteem can be the result. It is important to note that vacant esteem is the belief about one's worth, not a measure of one's actual worth. Vacant esteem, being a symptom of post-traumatic slave syndrome, is transmitted from generation to generation through the family, community, and society. When the parents and the family believe themselves to have little or no value, it reflects itself in behaviors that can instill a similar belief in their children. This belief is passed down through generations in the form of unexamined and often long-established child rearing practices. Some of the extreme ways we have worked to make our children submissive and docile, provide examples of established parenting practices that can contribute to vacant esteem. It's reinforced. I've seen it reinforced with my own eyes. We've seen it reinforced with our own eyes, within our own families, with our own communities, around us. This is how I feel about myself. I feel that that my worth from a scale of 1 to 10 is at a 2. So if my worth is at a 2 and you are my child, how are you better than me? So I'm going to teach you to be less than a 2. You're a 1. Your worth is a 1, and don't you dare try to be worth more than I am. It's like one thing my pops used to say that I never agreed with. He used to say, my granny, my dad used to tell me, he used to say, son, my granny used to tell us, we always were poor and we always will be poor. And I'm like, hell no. Hell no. Once again. So these are mindsets from both grandparents. I've told you stories about mindsets from both grandmothers. Grandmother on my mother's side is reinforcing the mindset of us being inferior to white people. Grandmother on my father's side is reinforcing the mindset of us being poor, of us having less than, of us being impoverished, of us always having to be in need of others. I reject those mindsets. Hell no. New programming installed. At the community levels, groups of people establish agreed upon beliefs about their members' worth. Beliefs that are reflected in the community standard and values regarding acceptable behavior, educational attainment, and professional possibilities. These standards and values translate into what achievements are believed to be practical and feasible for its members. Problems can arise when these standards and values promote counterproductive behaviors or inaccurately, I can't say the damn word, inaccurately limit what is truly attainable. All right, so that word won. So society contributes to the formation of vacant esteem in a number of ways, through its laws, institutions, and policies, as well as through the media. African Americans have been and continue to be disproportionately represented in our penal institutions. African Americans often live in neighborhoods where schools are functionally segregated and lack adequate revenue to sustain them. In African American communities, banks charge higher interest rates on home and auto loans, as well as make it more difficult for African Americans to get small business loans. The media contributes to vacant esteem's formation by frequently displaying African Americans as criminals, disadvantaged, academically deficient, and sexually irresponsible. All these and more serve to influence how African Americans perceive themselves and so impact their assessment of their own worth. We've been shown horrible images of ourselves for as long as especially the media has existed. So until we counter that, we will always believe that we are what white people told us that we are, inferior. And we ain't inferior to no damn body. So let me read this to you because this is very disturbing, but this is a great example of vacant esteem. So what are the signs of vacant esteem? What are some of the behaviors and attitudes associated with it? Consider this real life example. In the summer of 1992, two teenage boys, called them Carl and Dominic, got into an argument outside of a local high school in Portland. As onlookers watched, the argument, typically about nothing important, escalated until Carl pulled out a gun and pointed it at Dominic's face. The muzzle was no more than a foot from Dominic's eyes. He maintained perfectly still as he watched his adversary slowly pull the trigger. Click. Dominic did not run. Dominic did not attack. Instead, he said angrily, "Do you think I'm afraid to die? I ain't afraid to die." One of the witnesses ran to call the police as Carl worked at unjamming his gun. Someone screamed for Dominic to run as once again Carl pointed it at Dominic's head and pulled the trigger. Click! Jammed again. Still, Dominic didn't move. Again, Carl worked to unjam his gun. For the third time, he raised it up to Dominic's face and pulled the trigger. Click! Jammed again. The fourth time went off. Dominic was rushed to the hospital. The went through his jaw. Miraculously, he survived. So, most people looked upon this event as an attempt, and in fact, they witnessed another suicide attempt by a young black man. Too many young black men are looking, and while there is little glory in putting a in your own head, there is much glory in being in the shootout with rival gang members, because you live forever in the hood. You get a mural on the wall. You get your shoes through on the power lines. Get your face put on the t-shirt, and you get a nice grave plot. That's the glory. These are desperate young men believing that there is no hope of a future. They neither think nor care about their lives a year from now, let alone 5 or 10 or 15. Few of them expect to live past early 20s. Life for them is to be lived until they go to prison or get. The despair among many youth in inner city communities runs deep. Many of them have seen more poverty, violence, and degradation than any child should ever see. They're not afraid to die. They are afraid to live. It is a testament to their strength that any one of them ever makes it out. Invited is one indication of vacant esteem. It is a testament to an aspect of strength, but also a testament to the presence of insanity. Insanity brought on by white supremacy. So, ever-present danger. Ever-present danger, right? What is ever-present danger? How does it affect black people, right? To understand why many African Americans become angry so quickly, we must first understand the causes of anger. So, set the groundwork for this. She's talking about there's an ever-present danger in Black America because Black people can go to 0 to 60 real quick. And at any time, there could be a fight. And we all know this, especially when young Black people are around. Usually you're out having a good time somewhere in public and young Black folk come around, it's time to leave because it might be a fight or a shootout. But on top of that, Black people going from 0 to 60, particularly Black women going from 0 to 60 is celebrated. Getting angry and being out of control, not having any control over your anger or your emotions is often celebrated. And if you have the right look and can sell it right, you can be rewarded for your bad behavior. Ever-present danger is reinforced. Ever-present danger is allowed to germinate in Black America because that is how we exist now. So, in its simplest form, anger is the normal emotional response to a blocked goal. Often, if a person's goal remains blocked over time, they will begin to consider the possibility of failure and so experience fear. And when we are fearful, we also lash out in anger. All right. Read that again. In its simplest form, anger is the normal emotional response to a blocked goal. Often, if a person's goal remains blocked over time, they will begin to consider the possibility of failure and so experience fear. And when we experience fear, we lash out in anger. So, So anger can be both a response to the frustration of blocked goals and the fear of failure. Let's see how this works. A Black executive who has been working hard for a promotion by putting in extra hours and excelling in his productivity and efficiency may feel angry when he is denied advancement by his employer. His goal of advancement was blocked, and his response is anger. As a result, he is more determined than ever to get that promotion and becomes even more productive and efficient. Unfortunately, when the next round of promotions are handed out, he is passed over again. Now his anger is intensified because he likely is coming to believe his goal of promotion is no longer within his control. While some may consider simply working even harder for the next opportunity, when an individual experiences repeated stops despite great effort, working harder becomes less of an option, and the resulting intensified anger can often escalate to hostility and sometimes even violence. When the executive believed he had a chance at promotion, his anger at being passed over was expressed as determination. Now his anger is expressed in the form of rebellion. The executive focuses his anger on the boss rather than focusing on his goal of promotion. The deserving executive who repeatedly gets passed over for promotion could conceivably be angry enough to be overtly hostile. He almost certainly feels like it. If he thought it would do any good, he actually might express himself. He actually might express himself in such a manner, but he knows it would be counterproductive, so he stuffs his feelings. So what is the man to do? His anger and frustration have to find some outlet. Typically, when the target of a person's feelings is deemed to be out of reach, the person will take their feelings out on a safer target. It is likely our executive will express his hostility where it is safest, on those closest to him, like his family or friends, right? So it's an explanation of where a lot of our anger comes from as Black people. While we could be angry at each other for no reason, but we're angry at each other. And nowadays, anger turns to fighting and shooting. One of the most significant goals that have been blocked consistently by the dominant culture has been that of the African Americans' community integration into the greater society with all the responsibilities, rights, and privileges concomitant with membership. William Greer and Price Cobbs in their 1968 book Black Rage point out that the history of slavery and the failure of America to successfully integrate its Black citizens into the social and political fabric of America to allow them fair and equal access has led to a very real and lasting rage in African Americans, especially in the view of the lies perpetuated about equality of access to the powers that be. Blacks have been told lies about slavery. They have been told lies about being free, about inclusion, equality, and justice, about the pursuit of happiness, security, and prosperity, about civil rights, fair housing, education, and jobs. The lies have spanned centuries. What is most consistent is the absence of an accurate historical accounting of the elusive quest for equality and freedom for all of the citizens of the United States, especially those of color. Now, I would say we should stop looking to be included in the American society and put all of our energy and attention in building our own society. This society wasn't built for us to be included within it. But we have what we need to build for ourselves. We just choose not to. Unaggregated resources. If we aggregate our resources, like we talked about in Powernomics, if we aggregate our resources, we could have what we need for ourselves. They would not give us any type of anything that we need to be equal to them, because how can you be equal to your oppressors? Then who will be oppressed? So we got to take what's ours and build for ourselves and protect what we build for ourselves. Slavery was an inherently angry and violent process. White people molded anger and violence in every aspect of enslavement and every aspect of America. Remember, I always said slavery and violence is the foundation of America. Individuals were forcibly captured, chained, and regularly beaten into submission over hundreds of years. Any group of people living under such harsh conditions would eventually learn the ways of their captors. Thus, Africans learned that anger and violence were led by ingredients necessary to ensuring that their needs were met. It was anger and violence that created and maintained the institution of slavery, and this anger and violence continued long after slavery was abolished. The slave family experienced a markedly different form of social organization than any other group on American soil. The individual and family were socialized to endure and survive under extremely oppressive conditions. Generations were born, lived, and died enslaved in what has been purported to be the most free society in the history of the world, with their struggle for freedom, respect, and dignity attacked at every turn. These attacks continued long after slavery officially ended. So now let's get into breaking down racist socialization. Because remember, our 3 points that we're getting at, that 3 characteristics of PTSS. It is vacant esteem, ever-present anger, and racist socialization. Vacant esteem, ever-present anger, and racist socialization. So one summer around 1995, I was speaking to a group of high school sophomores about human sexuality and individual responsibility. Part of the course dealt with establishing healthy relationships and issues of gender. I was taken aback by one of the young men when he told me, "My mother told me to never bring home anybody as black as me." The young man had the skin color of dark chocolate. It was smooth, blemish-free, and quite beautiful, like that of his mother. My disturbed look must have shown clearly given what followed. Before I could respond, he said almost apologetically, "Oh, but I could bring someone like you," meaning, of course, that I was fair-skinned enough to meet his mother's approval. I explained to him how unfortunate it was that his mother had grown to believe that dark skin was something negative, and that I did not feel complimented she would approve of my skin color. I could only imagine how it must have felt for her as a black woman growing up and believing that there was something wrong with her skin color, then having a child that served almost as a course and a constant reminder of her own unworthiness. At what effect did this have on her son? Predictably enough, this same young man married a fair-skinned woman of another race, perhaps in hopes of escaping the stigma he had associated with being black that was passed down by his mother, that was passed down to her, or she adopted that, right? But it's a legacy. We call it colorism. It's a legacy of colorism that goes both ways, that affects both black men and black women. It affects you whether you're a dark skin or light skin. And let me hit on that for a minute, because I'm sick and tired of black people only thinking that dark skin is beautiful. Don't tell me that black is beautiful, but then we're only praising dark skinned women. I get it. Dark skinned women and dark skinned black people have been degraded, have been relegated to the bottoms of society. I get it. Light skinned black people have been praised by the white society, but light skinned black people have gone through shit too. Being black is not something that has protected us in any form. Being a lighter black or darker black, you experience different types of oppression, different types of racism. Different types doesn't mean one is greater than the other. It's different. Whether you're a light-skinned black person or a dark-skinned black person, or you're in the middle, you're beautiful, you're worthy, you have value. It is not just about being dark-skinned. It's not just about being light-skinned. If you're a black person, you have value, you are worthy. Whether your skin is the darkest of the dark or the lightest of the light. Don't let nobody try to tell you otherwise. if we're going to praise blackness, let's praise blackness from the darkest of the dark to the lightest of the light. And if you can't do that, you're part of the problem, and you're adding to the negative images that we have. You're adding to the racial socialization that we have. It is not uncommon for people to be held captive, for people being held captive to take on the views and attitudes of their captors. At times, under the stressful conditions associated with being held captive, people can identify so closely with their tormentors, they become like them, which we have. Stockholm syndrome. This transition has been known to occur after months of captivity and sometimes even only after a few weeks. So what do you think may happen to a people who have been held captive for generations? And our minds have been held captive for a long time as well. One of the most insidious and pervasive symptoms of post-traumatic slave syndrome is our adaptation of our slave masters' value systems. At this value system's foundation is to believe that white and all things associated with whiteness are superior, and that black and all things associated with blackness are inferior. Through the centuries of slavery and the decades of institutionalized oppression that followed, many African Americans have, in essence, been socialized to be something akin to white races. Many of us have adopted the attitudes and views of whites. White races, America. Many of us look at ourselves and our community through the eyes of whites. We both mold ourselves to accommodate white prejudices and endeavor to adopt white standards. There's a whole lot of black folk that want to be white. Unconsciously and unconsciously. It's a whole lot of black folk that want to be white. This is made manifest in a myriad of ways. Many African Americans have adopted white standards, including those of beauty and material success, as well as violence and brutality. Some of those who have reached the highest levels of American society have denied the roles of the civil rights movement in their success. Others consistently argue against the value of the concept of affirmative action. Clarence Thomas. They have become akin to modern day overseers, having fully adopted the whites version of the American dream. Like many of their white peers, seem to believe that slavery ended in 1865 and everything has been fine since. At the same time, some African Americans project an image of inferiority through their behavior, thus confirming the views of white racists who believe themselves superior. When so many of our youth glamorize thug life and lack of education, when their primary avenues of aspiration are athletics and entertainment, and when males and females, young and old, are sexually irresponsible, we make very real the prejudice of white America and give life to their caricatures of African Americans. We don't have to reinforce the behaviors. We continue to reinforce the behaviors. And let me say this too. The purpose of reading this book is to understand what happened to us, but it's not to justify us continuing to be victims, continuing to having a victim mindset, continuing to say, well, I can't improve because of the trauma that happened. Bullshit, 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 bullshit. We have so many examples of Black people who have triumphed over the trauma during slavery. So don't give me no excuses of why we can't triumph now, why we can't have a new program inserted, why we can't have a paradigm shift. We can do it. We just have to put the effort into doing it. We have to learn what happened to us, and learn how to move, how to become better from it, how to grow from it, how to replace the programming. That's what that's why we read the books. That's why we go through the information that our master teachers have given us, so we can take this information and utilize it. Yes, we know we have been victimized, but no, we will not remain victims. All right. These are more indications of racial socialization, and it is easy to see how such socialization came about. From the time of their captors or births, slaves saw whites as strong, rich, well-fed, secure, and healthy. In relation to themselves, whites were perceived to be powerful and dominant. Slaves, of course, had the opposite qualities. Relative to whites, they were weak, poor, impoverished, insecure, and unhealthy. Simply put, They were impotent and submissive. Which with Excuse me. So which set of qualities would you wish to have? Would you wish to have the qualities of the whites or the qualities of the blacks? And remember, these are the qualities that are being pushed out by the media. These are the qualities that are being associated with black people. But this is how we're socialized. This is what's being told to black people and about black people and by black people on a regular basis. This is who you are. This is all you can be. And this is what you will always ever be. You're on the bottom. African Americans have a unique socialization experience due to having centuries of systematic and traumatic programming of inferiority. This inferiority covered all aspects of one's being. In other words, from the beginning, Africans were taught they were inferior physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually, thus rendering them completely ineffectual in their own eyes and the eyes of the society around them. At the end of slavery, little change in dispelling these notions. In fact, since the abolition of slavery, such notions have continued to infiltrate all aspects of American life. Vacant esteem, ever-present anger, racist socialization. These effects of almost 4 centuries of legalized abuse, program enslavement, and institutionalized oppression can be seen today. Centuries of slavery and oppression and the resulting post-traumatic slave syndrome have impacted the lives of many, many African Americans. To believe otherwise is nonsensical. So this is what post-traumatic slave syndrome is. And this is the trauma that happened to us. So now the goal is to fix what happened to us, to move forward fixing what happened to us. Because that's the whole purpose of therapy. That's the whole purpose of the whole field of Black psychology. It's to learn what happened to us, and the field of history, to learn what happened to us, how it happened to us, why it happened to us, when it happened to us, where it happened to us, who did it to us, and fix that, to repair what happened to us. Any Black person who looks at what happened to us and stools in victimhood, you are helping to continue the legacy of white supremacy. Any Black person who continues to just use the victimhood as an excuse, not a reason, but an excuse. If you're telling me what you can't do and you're not putting in any effort, it's one thing to say, to show that you've put in effort and are being blocked. That's one thing. But to not put in any effort because you have the belief that you can't, nah, that's a slave mindset. That's a slave mindset. We're no longer slaves. We're free, autonomous human beings who can create what we want. And the future goal is to create a grand society for ourselves. But we must understand what happened. And we must get past the post-traumatic slave syndrome. But the only way to get past it is to address it and deal with it and get some treatment for it. So shout out to Dr. Joy DeGroot, post-traumatic slave syndrome. So that was chapter 4, pages 110 to 138 of post-traumatic slave syndrome. Chapter 4, pages 110 to 138. So the next video will be chapter 5, pages 140 to 176. So next video, chapter 5, will be pages 140 to 176, Slavery's Children. Hey, let the healing begin. We read this to heal, not to stew in victimhood. Let the healing begin. We can and we will. We can and we will. We can and we will. I love you all. Make sure y'all catch the next video. Like, comment, subscribe, share, all that good jazz. Ways to support me is in the bio. It's in the description, rather. Thank y'all.